On behalf of the Asia Society's Japan Center, welcome to today's Art for Breakfast webinar. My name is Chris Wells, and I'm the co-chair, together with Professor Horiyuchi of Tama University, of the Arts Committee of the Asia Society's Japan Center. Please note that your microphone is muted when joining the webinar, and we request that you keep your mic muted during the presentation portion of our webinar. Questions are welcome during today's webinar. To ask a question, please click on the Q&A function in the Zoom menu bar and type in your question. The moderator will, that's me, will address your question to the speaker after the presentation portion of the webinar. Today's webinar is entitled The Sackler Gallery and its Japanese Art Collection. And this is the first in the Arts Committee's series of presentations intended to feature Japanese and Asian collections located outside of Japan. Our speaker today is Frank Feltens, who is the Japan Foundation Assistant Curator of Japanese Art at the and Sackler Galleries of the National Museum of Asian Art, located at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Mr. Felton holds a PhD in Japanese art history from Columbia University and specializes in Japanese early modern painting. He has lectured and published widely on various aspects of Japanese art, ranging from 17th century painting to post-war photography. He is also a practitioner of the tea ceremony in the Urasenke tradition and holds the tea name Sochoku. And with that introduction, I will turn the webinar over to Frank. Thanks very much for joining us. Frank?
Thank you very much, Chris, for that very kind introduction. And I'm very glad to be here from Washington. And thank you all for joining at such an early hour. But I know from having lived in Japan for many years that many people on that side of the world are early risers. So 8 o'clock might not be early for you. And I also want to thank the Asia Society of Japan for inviting me, and especially Sawako Hidaka and her fantastic team, whose organization could not have been more professional. So thank you very much. Let me share my screen and show you what we'll be talking about today. So as Chris mentioned, I work for the Sackler Gallery of Art and Art and Sackler Gallery, which are together the Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art. And like with many eponymous museums, we are very much fascinated with the history of our collections, and especially also with the history with our founder and their vita and various other aspects that influence their collecting. And this is just a view for you of the Sackler Gallery of Art if you haven't been to Washington yet and visited our museum. And if this pandemic is over finally, so hopefully soon, I encourage you to come and visit us, and do call us in advance so we can give you a little tour. And this is actually a really recent photograph, and you notice that there is a little poster outside. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in the center right column, there is a little bit a poster advertising our current Hokusai exhibition, which I will be closing my 30-minute remarks today with. The museum opened in 1923 and was founded on the collections of this individual, Charles Lang Freer, who was an industrialist, collector, and who arguably brought together one of the most significant collections of Asian art as a whole outside Japan. And we are fortunate that he was very interested in Japan and that he brought together a number of incredibly important works of art, some of which I will show you today. And but Freer is really very much an American rags to riches story, because I mean, he was born, as you see, in 1854 in Kingston, New York. And if you haven't heard about Kingston, New York, you're not alone. There are a lot of people who probably haven't heard of it. It's a small town in the Hudson Valley, very picturesque, and a place where a lot of New Yorkers have their weekend homes these days. But in Freer's time, it was a very humble place to be born and a humble place to be brought up. And he was the third child of 6 siblings. His mother died when he was 14. His family was anything but wealthy. And Freer um, left school in 7th grade, so very early, and entered the business world and climbed his way up to become a very significantly wealthy individual. And just for you to locate where Kingston is actually on the map, if you go up from New York City, it takes about 3 hours to make your way to Poughkeepsie right here. And then it probably takes a little, I've never actually made the pilgrimage, but I always hope to do that at some point to go back to the roots of our dear founder, if you will. But this is, and just to show you that this is actually a very remote area. And Freer made most of his money in Detroit, but traveled around the US quite a bit as he was working in the railroad business. And several trips brought him to New York. And the story is such that he got in touch with, that he was exposed there and in various other places that he visited and collectors' homes that he saw with the art of James McNeill Whistler, one of, you know, America's great painters of the late 19th century, who resided most of his time, most of his life in England, actually. And Freer was enthralled by Whistler's style and especially was drawn to his etchings and drawings. And that is a very particular taste, and that really formulated Freer's eyes and how he looked at art and thought about the hand of the artist being incredibly important in an artwork. And this is a kind of early formation of his eyes and artistic sensibility that carried on throughout his time as a collector. And it's really reflected in the collection as it is today. And I should say already now that when Freer left his collection to the Smithsonian Institution, he did not include a single Japanese print in that gift, which is extraordinary for a collector of that time. Usually collections consisted of mostly prints, or if not, there were some prints at least involved. But Freer was so conscious of you know, the immediacy of an artist's hand being very important. And so he wanted his collection to reflect that, his personal approach. So long story short, he started collecting these kinds of Whistler etchings, and reportedly in 1887, he purchased his first Japanese art piece. But if you look at the entirety of things that he collected in 1887, this is the only work that is not by an American artist. And it kind of looks as like an anomaly. And one of my colleagues has actually suggested that the accession number of this work might not be correct, that he actually purchased this work a little bit later. So, but the final verdict is still out there. And I should say about our accession numbers, what you see here, F1887, means that Freer purchased this in 1887 ostensibly, and was the first work of the first work purchased in that year. But it doesn't really matter whether he really bought it in this year. It's important that he started collecting Japanese art. And Japanese art is the first area, the first non-Western area of art that he really delved into, even before going to Japan himself. And if you are familiar with the style of Ogata Korin, you immediately start saying, okay, well, this might not be right, but in the beginning, many collections are a hit and miss story, and so is Freer's. And there is no need to hide that part of the collection as well, because we have plenty of masterpieces that he also brought together. And then if you move upwards in the 1890s, Freer starts collecting more and more Japanese art. And he focuses, and you can see here on the left and in the middle, he really follows that trend in paintings, particularly that he established by collecting American etchings and drawings by Whistler and others. He was, like I said, interested in the artist's hand, and he followed that trend by collecting ink paintings, which is really extraordinary for a budding collector of Japanese art. But he was also very much interested in Kyoto-based ceramics, such as those on the right here that was attributed to Nonomura Ninsei, the 17th century potter, but is probably a later 18th century work. But he collected quite a number of those Kyoto-based pottery pieces early on. But as Freer continued to be interested in Japan, he actually went there in 1895. For the first time, he left America, and not for the first, well, he left on a world trip, basically. That took him to Europe via the Near East, via India, Southeast Asia, places like that. And he eventually came to Japan. And he stayed there for a total of 4 months, which is the longest time that he stayed anywhere, really. And he clearly, anywhere in Asia, I should say. And he clearly was drawn to Japan in a very special and very visceral way, even perhaps. And in 1895, sorry, when he went there for the first time, he pretty much discovered Japan as a tourist. You can see in his diaries, which survive actually in our archives, that he, and they're wonderful to read because they give very interesting insights into Freer's state of mind at any given time and his very particular interests. So when he was there in 1895, he checked basically all the sites. He went to Nikko, he went to Kyoto, he went to Kobe, of course, where he and Yokohama, the big port cities, Tokyo. So he traveled around the country and discovered it. He was a tourist. And when he came back, he started collecting rather differently. He became a much more discerning collector, although his habit was to collect in bulk. He rarely bought a single piece of art. He had a tendency of buying full collections or parts of full collections or an assortment of things that art dealers would present him with, and then he would select groups of pieces from that. And some of the nice works that he brought together early on in the 1890s are these two ceramic pieces. The right Kenzan amber pot is one of my favorites because I really love how the famous potter Kenzan in the 18th century emulated Delftware from the Netherlands. So this kind of, it translates this beautiful interest in exoticism and the foreign that people in Kyoto embraced at the time. And Freer also moved more and more into purchasing gorgeous and important paintings. And many of the early large format works that he brought together belong to the Rimpa tradition, the tradition associated with Tawara Yasotatsu, Ogata Korin, Sakai Hoitsu, that Edo period tradition of painting flowers and using sumptuous materials like gold backgrounds and emphatically flat compositions. And Freer, much like his contemporaries, was drawn to that aesthetic. But he didn't quite arrive at those decisions all by himself, of course. I mean, any collector is impacted in one way or another by what is happening around them and what other collectors are bringing together and what scholars, for example, say. And in Freer's case, Ernest Fenollosa, the famous pioneer of East Asian art, played an important part. And Freer began associating with him starting in the 1890s. And also, he didn't just read Fenollosa's writings or listen to his lectures or talk to him directly, but he also purchased artworks directly from him. And one of those first purchases is one of our most famous and most beloved pieces, actually, this painting by Hokusai of the boy viewing Mount Fuji, one of also my personal favorites because it's so atmospheric. You can almost hear the sounds that are embedded in this painting, right? I mean, the gushing of the water, the slight rustling in the wind here, and then intermingled with into all of that, the sound of the flute of this boy who's actually, neglecting his work. He should be fishing. This basket is probably for fish from the river, but he decided he wants to play music instead, which is really lovely. And he is disregarding the tempest that is approaching from the upper left, which is actually really timely because right now in Washington, we have quite a thunderstorm raging outside. If you can hear rumbling, that's right outside my window right here. And like I said, Freer brought together collections that he deemed important. So, and one of those early groups of works are the so-called group of about a dozen tea bowls, which he said belonged to the Prince of Kaga, which would have probably been the daimyo of Kaga domain, which is in Ishikawa prefecture nowadays in Western Japan, and the Maeda family ruled over that domain, and they were a very cultured dynasty and brought together quite a number of important works of art. And Freer snatched away some of their tea bowls, and this is one of the better ones. Not a Japanese piece, but a Korean Joseon period work that from the 16th century that probably came into the country at some later point. And as his taste developed, he brought together more and more very important masterpieces. And one of those works is this Kano Eitoku screen, purchased in 1900. And then the only tea bowl by Honami Koetsu in America, or outside Japan, which is really quite a catch. And unfortunately, the bowl doesn't come with its accompanying box. And as you know, in Japanese art, often, especially tea utensils come in inscribed tomobako, accompanying boxes. And they are usually used to authenticate the works. And in this case, unfortunately, the box doesn't survive. The original box doesn't survive, but we do have a couple of boxes where we can glean its poetic name, Minogame, a mossy tortoise, which is a reference to these lines here, almost like a mossy tail of an ancient tortoise. And Freer didn't just look at old works, at pre-modern artworks to bring into his collection, but also works that to him and his time were almost contemporary, actually. So he was in a way also a contemporary art collector, and he was collecting the state-of-the-art new trends of Japanese painting that are embodied in this mesmerizing and somewhat bizarre painting of the Bodhisattva canon, imagined as almost an avatar of the Virgin Mary, painted by the famous modern Kano painter Kano Hokusai, who was at the forefront, inspired by Fenollosa and other people to, if you will, modernize Japanese painting and bring Japanese painting into the modern age of the 19th century, late 19th century. And he did so by paying stronger attention to shading, perspective, recession in space, proportions. So, but always adhering to the traditional aesthetic as well, as much as possible. So this is one of the star pieces from, I would say, modern Japanese painting that made it into our collection. And then as Freer brought more and more works of art together, of course, he thought about what would happen if he were no longer on this earth. And he was thinking about places where to give his collection to and where it would be properly displayed. And he made an overture to the Smithsonian Institution in the early 1900s. And the Smithsonian was at that time not an art-focused institution. It was focused on the sciences, and it was founded on that premise as well. So the regents of the Smithsonian and its governing body were initially reluctant to accept Freer's gift, which indeed was very generous because Freer was also offering funds for constructing a museum. So, but the Smithsonian wasn't yet sold. But then, of course, geopolitical events always make a change in one way or another, and the Russo-Japanese War happened in 1904 and 1905. And this triptych of prints is also in our collection in the Sackler. And enter Theodore Roosevelt, who, as you know, was the one who brokered the peace treaty between the Russian Empire and the Empire of Japan. the Treaty of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And so Roosevelt looked at Japan, the first Asian non-Western power to defeat a Western imperialist nation. He realized that this is a significant geopolitical shift, and he realized that the world will no longer be the same. And he surmised that the Americans, in order to prevail, if you will, in order to understand East Asia and particularly Japan, needed to do so by way of its culture. And so he wrote this several letters actually to the Smithsonian, but they were preceded by this December 6th St. Nicholas Day letter in 1905 inviting Freer to the White House, and I love to show this letter because it is so, you would never get a letter like this from the President of the United States these days, where he says, you know, please, can you wire me a day where you're available, basically. You cannot just call up the president these days unless you have special connections, I suppose. But in Freer's case, Freer had those special connections and certainly Roosevelt's backing. And in a letter to the Smithsonian Institution, 10 days later, in December 19th of the same year, he wrote, "It is impossible to speak in too high terms of the munificence shown by Mr. Freer in his offer. And it is one which the government of the United States should at once close with as a matter of course." In his flowery, if direct language that is really typical for Teddy Roosevelt, I guess. But he, in so many words, he realized that Freer's gift and the art collection that he had was of the national interest. And so the Smithsonian Institution accepted the gift in 1906 officially, and with the agreement that the collection and the funds would enter the possession of the US government once Freer passes away. And until then, Freer was exhilarated by this by this very prestigious association with first the American president and also with the Smithsonian Institution, that when he went back to Japan again in 1907, so there was a hiatus of about 10 years between his first trip and when he went back, he was received in Japan not anymore as this average American tourist, but as a philanthropist of the highest caliber. And one of the, with deep connections to the National Museum of America, as it was called back then, and the Smithsonian Institution. So suddenly all kinds of doors opened for Freer, among them mainly with Japanese major industrialists, such as this individual here in this photograph, Hara Sanke or Hara Tomitaro, a silk manufacturer who was one of Japan's most influential men of culture and collectors at the time. And he was so, smitten by Freer really and attracted to him in a way that he, upon Freer's visit to Hara, he gave him this hand scroll, this 14th century hand scroll, for example, as a gift. And that is now also in our collection. And now that Freer had a home for his collection and he knew that it would enter the ownership of the United States, he kept collecting big time. And he brought together some of the most extraordinary works in his collection after he actually, sealed the deal with the Smithsonian Institution. And among those is this 1906 purchase of this pair of screens by Tawaraya Sotatsu, which really, if they had remained in Japan, would probably be at least, probably a national treasure level. And this is not the only work that fits into that category. And we are very, humbled that it is now in our museum. And it's, of course, one of the star pieces of the collection, of the Japanese collections. And, but like Sotatsu's famous screen, Waves of Matsushima, Freer acquired the best, I would say, the most significant pieces, not while he was traveling in Japan on his 5 trips in total, but when he was in America and interacted with famous art leaders like Yamanaka, Kobayashi Bunchichi, Matsuki Bunkyo, these people. But he also sometimes brought back home very wonderful pieces. So this Kaike Bodhisattva, which is an important Buddhist sculpture from the 12th century, very early, was purchased while he was in Yokohama, and he had it shipped back home. But after Freya passed away in 1919, the collection and funds to construct the Sackler Gallery of Art, along with bonds and railroad shares, entered the ownership of the U.S. government through the Smithsonian Institution. And the museum it did not freeze its collection in time. It continues to develop the collection further and further. And one of the early purchases after the museum was opened in 1923 was this 12th century Horokaku mandala, which is really unique and one of its kind, and has garnered quite a bit of interest among Japanese scholars, particularly because of its role to aristocratic practices of Buddhism, esoteric Buddhism mainly. But the collection grows and grows through gifts and purchases altogether. And this little Buddha sculpture right here that you see, the Buddha at birth, was given to us in 2005 as part of a larger gift of fantastic works of early calligraphy. And if you know the story of the historical Buddha, he was born from the side of his mother underneath her arm, and immediately upon touching down on the earth, started walking into each direction and pointing to heaven and earth and declaring that he's basically the savior of the universe, so to speak. But Buddhism arrived in Japan in the 6th century, probably in the shape of a sculpture that looked very much like this. And this is not bigger than your palm. So it's a very small, compact object, but nonetheless powerful. And just to show you, give you a little preview of the most recent acquisitions through a major gift that we received, about 260 works of mainly early modern and modern paintings and calligraphy from the collection of Mary and Cheney Coles, who are very interested in these areas. So with one strike, really, the Freer collections managed to propel itself into the 20th century and add significant holdings in these mesmerizing works. For example, this 1987 calligraphy by Suda Kokta here, painted in frozen ink that is frozen and then unfrozen. And by that process, it creates this rough surface, these bubbles, and which creates a really tactile surface structure, which I personally find incredibly appealing. But then also really atmospheric, beautiful works like Terasaki Kogyo's Summer Afternoon here from 1910, or also a large portion of works by Tomioka Tessai. And we actually have an exhibition right now in the Sackler that should be open, but it's not. And hopefully when the museum does reopen, we'll be able to let people enjoy these works by Tessai that illustrates the simpatico between China and Japan in the late 19th century and early 20th century, at a time when politically both countries were bitter enemies. As you know, there were several wars fought between the two countries. And I want to end today's remarks about the Freer and its history to think about Charles Freer's favorite Japanese painter, Katsushika Hokusai. And in order to celebrate the centennial of his death, last year we opened an exhibition of Hokusai's paintings in our collections. And without wanting to sound boastful, but the Sackler Gallery of Art, thanks to Charles Freer's collecting interest, has actually the biggest collection of Hokusai's paintings, drawings, and sketches in the world, even including Japan. So this is an institutional pleasure and also obligations to showcase these works once in a while. So I mean, the centennial of Freer's death gave us a beautiful opportunity to bring out these fantastic pieces again. And just to walk you a little bit through the galleries, this is how it looks like the Freer. And if you notice, if you look up to the ceiling, really, you notice, an idiosyncratic feature of our museum's architecture. And if you look at the background behind me, this is the courtyard, a photo of the courtyard of the museum. So it's very architecturally interesting and beautiful building. But one of the idiosyncratic features is that we have natural light coming into the galleries. But we are filtering the light so it doesn't damage the artworks, but the light in the galleries changes by way of having these windows up there. Now, depending on what season or what time of the day you come to the museum. So it gives you a very different experience actually in seeing the artworks depending on where you come, even though it might be the same piece of art. And I've always enjoyed that experience, particularly because Japanese paintings are made for a different kind of climate. They are not made for, the brightly lit galleries of 21st century museums. They are made for the dark chambers of Japanese architecture. So it's an aesthetic that comes together in the gloomy light of a traditional building. Just quickly about Freer was incredibly interested in Hokusai's sketches and drawings. And so I brought out an example of one of those for your viewing pleasure this morning. And the story of this work is interesting because it is the story of Abe no Seimei. And if you haven't heard the name Abe no Seimei, he is sort of the Japanese version of Merlin, the idiosyncratic magician and diviner, basically, onmyodo master. And the story is such that Abe no Seimei's mother is actually not a real human being, but a fox who appeared to his father after he had rescued or shielded a fox from hunters. And this is, beautifully illustrates this relationship between these three people, with Abe no Seimei's fox mother here and these little mouse-like foxes up there with their spirit light above them in the darkness. You have to imagine this being in a very eerie atmosphere in a nighttime shrine. But Freer was drawn to these drawings because his assumption was, probably correctly, that every single stroke here was done by Hokusai himself, rather than a polychromatic painting which involves different hands. And Freer was very much conscious of the Japanese workshop practice in producing traditional art, which is similar to the Renaissance. Here are some of the fantastic screen paintings in the exhibition. And then the final gallery closes with Hokusai's last decade in his 80s. And Freer's, this is one of Freer's purchases from actually the collection of one of Hokusai's last pupils' descendants. So the provenance is really interesting of these. And but these works are also probably one of Hokusai's last paintings that he made, because if you read Japanese, you can see that he inscribed them saying, "Old man of age 90." And Hokusai lived to the age of 90, and he spent about, by the Japanese count, 6 months being 90 years old. And you can see that the signature is not drawn in the exacting straight hand that Hokusai was normally capable of, but in the shaky, uncertain way of painting of a person still not able to control their bodily functions as much anymore. So I always find this a moving testament to Hokusai's very final moments, really. And if you look at this face of the woodcutter and the fisherman here, they are shown at the end of a day of labor, a day's work accomplished, everything is done, everything is good, they're happy with what they've done. So in a way, this is a summation of Hokusai's interesting life. But I don't want to close with Hokusai, but with Freer, get the ball back to the founder of the museum by showing you this memorial stone that is erected at Koetsuji, a temple in Kyoto in 1930 by Masuda Takashi, the industrialist associated with the Mitsui conglomerate. And but the very presence of having such a memorial stone at an important cultural temple in Kyoto speaks of Freer's recognition in Japan and his association with industrialists like Hara and Masuda, and his personal and very private connection and personal connection to Japan as a country, because it was the only country outside of America or outside of the Western sphere that he encountered in his time, where he met people like himself, self-made industrialists, collectors, and he felt particularly simpatico to those people and also to the country's culture. All right, this is exactly 30 minutes, and if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box, I understand. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Frank. That was really great, really very interesting, all that I had hoped to hear about the Freer. For those of you who've never visited the Freer Gallery in Washington, this is one of the absolute most serene and wonderful places to spend time. I mean, if you're in Washington and you have time, please budget enough time to go there, because not only are the works that are in exhibition wonderful to see, but it's a very accessible museum, and that you can do the whole museum in a half day, but you're much better off if you spend the day. And it has a garden, a Japanese garden that's very beautiful, and it has Chinese motif garden as well. Those of you that know the Freer know that it has other exhibitions and galleries as well. It has a very superb Chinese painting gallery as well as the Japanese painting, and then various others. If you look, I'd like to encourage everybody to explore the Smithsonian website, which has some very interesting prior exhibitions that have gone on there, one of which was one of my favorite ones, which is the one for Shinhanga and Sosakuhanga, which I guess I missed. It was a year and a half ago. I think that was one of yours, Frank, right?
That was my first special exhibition, quote unquote, since after I got hired at the museum. Yeah, I don't even remember when that was, 17, 18. Yeah.
So can you give us an idea, how many pieces are in the original Freer collection, and then how many pieces have been acquired since then?
Yeah, the full Freer gift, that is all Asian and American art, together is about 4,000 pieces. And I believe the Japanese portion of that was about 1,000 to 1,500, give or take. I don't have a precise number in my head, but it has grown until since then to about 15,000 pieces. But no, they are not just exclusively in the Freer Gallery's collection, but also in the Sackler. I mean, we have a substantial collection of Japanese prints, Shinhanga, Sosakuhanga most recently, that are in the Sackler collections. And so both collections are separate, but they are administered by the same staff, so we count them together. Yeah, sorry.
Is the Sackler collection co-located with the Freer collection? I mean, it's in the same building?
They are both in different buildings, so they are geographically separate, but the museums are tied, architecturally tied together. So the Freer collection storage is in the basement, basically, of the Freer Gallery, and Sackler is the same in the Sackler Gallery. They are not, they cannot be stored together, because the Freer stipulated in his will that the collections may not leave the building, so we can only display Freer works either in the Freer or on the Sackler, and but we cannot display Sackler works in the Freer. That's where it gets complicated.
Okay, that makes making an exhibition a little more complex. Yeah.
Yeah, it keeps you on your toes, but it's interesting.
Okay. So we have a couple of questions from one of our founders, Jennifer Rogers. what spurred Freer to collect so much of Hokusai in particular?
Yeah, I think there are many factors at work here. I mean, Freer, for one, in the 1890s suffered from sort of a nervous disorder, if you will, mental, that wasn't uncommon among the upper class of America at the time, and it was more of a sense of fatigue and stress imposed by busy lives and busy work. And so in order to cure that, the common remedy would usually be to spend more time in nature or to do something soothing. And in Freer's case, I think a big role there played collecting art. And in Hokusai's case, Hokusai was such an incredible student of the world around him and of the essence of things that he presented Freer with almost like an alternate universe, a universe that is close to your own, but still different and removed, something where you could sort of escape basically from your daily routine, if you will, without moving too much away from it. And in the same way as nature offered Freer a respite from the stresses of the world, really. And I think that was one attraction of Hokusai. And another was, him being influenced by Fenollosa, who was the first, who held the first exhibition of Hokusai's paintings in Boston in 1893, and then another in 1900 in Tokyo. So Hokusai's affection for, Fenollosa's affection for Hokusai certainly was an impetus for Freer as well. But he had a mind of its own, really, where he wouldn't just follow the advice of outside scholars or dealers or other advisors, but would see how he reacts to a specific work and then add it to his collection.
I think all of us know Hokusai's prints very, very well. I mean, they're probably as iconic of Japan as any sets of artwork. But the paintings, I think, are less well known. How many paintings does the Freer have? And do you have any idea what the universe of paintings of Hokusai are?
I don't know the total number of works worldwide, but our collection has about more than 200 paintings, sketches, and drawings all together. And among those, the canon of Hokusai, of accepted Hokusai works, genuine Hokusai works, shifts constantly. And give or take, I think about 40 to 50 of those paintings, hanging scrolls, screens, hand scrolls are genuine. And then a large number of the sketches are, and probably virtually all of the preparatory drawings, of which I showed you one today, safe to say that those are actually by Hokusai's own hand. So that makes for a very substantial number of genuine works by Hokusai that probably go into 100 pieces or so. So that's quite a catch and a very fortunate circumstance to be in here. Hokusai is incredibly popular. I mean, we had a good number of people visit before the pandemic struck. So, and we hope to get more once we reopen.
Okay, so we have another question. It mentions the photo. You showed a 1970 photo of Freer in Japan, and there's appears to be a Western woman in the photo, also in the photo. So do you know who traveled with him on that collecting trip or his other collecting trip?
Yeah, I'm a curious student of Freer's life and everything around him, but I haven't dug in that deeply, particularly also because all my Freer-related books are in my office, which is off limits at this time. So I cannot tell you exactly who this individual is, although she was I know as much that she was a close associate of Freer traveling with him, and he actually. spent quite a bit of time, also with Fenollosa's spouse and former spouse eventually. And, he had a lot of female friends in the large group of associations. Catherine Rhodes, for example, was in charge after he was put in charge to take care of his estate and make sure the Sackler Gallery was created in his, like he wanted it, basically. And then Catherine Graham, the former owner of the Washington Post, was also a close associate of Freer's. So we had a large circle of friends. And I'm sorry, I cannot answer that specific questions right now.
So another question was about the Hokusai exhibit itself. Is that still current, or was it supposed to close but it didn't close? You mentioned that the photo was very recent and we could see the Hokusai exhibit.
Right. So it's with the museum, the exhibition was also closed, but it wasn't taken down. So of course, in order to shield the works of art, we covered every case laboriously. Our conservators did that very kindly, and to make sure that the pigments don't suffer by being, up there for a certain amount of time. But we are hoping to extend the exhibition once the museum reopens. So it was initially scheduled to close in November this year. And so now the closing date the new closing date is January next year, but there are chances that it might get pushed back a little bit further, hopefully, because right now we're in the first rotation of 2, so there is more to be shown, really.
Yeah, I was going to say, I hope you do push it back, because it's really unlikely I'll be in Washington before next January, but given the way things are. And you were mentioning on the rotation, for people who've actually seen that exhibit on when it opened, it will be rotated. There will be a second rotation of additional work.
Yeah, so that is, of course, to show as much as possible, but also to adhere to our conservation standards, which are such that we only show a Japanese painting for 6 months within the course of 5 years. So this is the maximum display time. So the first rotation is 6 months, so then we switch out everything basically, and have the exhibition open for another 6 months. So that's the original plan.
Okay, I was wondering, can you say something about how, I noticed that in terms of contemporary Japanese art, when I looked at the collection, it appeared that was mostly photographs, okay? I would say perhaps that was your influence. I don't know if that's the case or not, but there are several very famous photographers whose works are shown, but there are, for example, no contemporary print artists or painting artists from Japan. Is that, how does the Freer make a decision about what contemporary art to select from Japan for exhibition or for the permanent collection? And what areas do you collect for Japanese art? I mean, it's not, I know you have ceramics as well, and I'm curious about the composition of the overall collection.
Yeah, so first of all, the credit for building the photography collection is not my own, but my colleagues, Carol Ha, who's curator of contemporary art at our museum, and she has brought together a fantastic array of Japanese photography, most recently by adding the collection of Willard Haig and Gloria Katz, and many of the works that you probably encountered online are part of that collection, and that includes a large number of famous photographers. And we are incredibly thrilled to have those. But those works are all in the Sackler collection. They were not accessioned to the Freer. And the same is also true for modern and contemporary prints. They would also be found in the Sackler collection. I mean, all of that is accessible on our online database. So you can see pretty much the entire collections that we have, except for maybe the very newest editions, which take some time to be photographed and put online. But in terms of collecting practices, of course, it's a shared effort between curators. So I'm not alone in the Japan department. Kit Brooks is my colleague here. And so we work together in finding exceptional works of art that, could be worthy, if you will, to be added into the Freer or Sackler collections. And then also we receive a number of gifts, and, which is always a huge delight. And recently we've added quite a number of private collections in the Japanese area. A big collection of Sosaku Hanga by Ken and Kyo Hitch, about 2,000 pieces. And then the Coles collection that goes into the Freer, which is 20th century, 17th basically to 20th century painting and calligraphy. But we wanted to add the Coles collection to the Freer because although it goes into the modern, not quite into the contemporary realm, but into the modern area of the 20th century, in order to basically also stay true to developing the collection in also Freer's in the way that he did it. I mean, when he purchased the paintings by Kano Hogai, those works were not much older to him than some of the works in the Coles collection are to us now. So as curators, if you collect something, you don't collect it for yourself, you collect it for the institution, and you are a little bit like the Catholic Church. You don't think in decades, you think in centuries, pretty much. What will stand the test of time, what will still be a great piece of art in 100 years or 200 years of time, and what will the collection look like, and how should it look like in that span of time. So this is something we always keep in the back of our heads.
Did Freer make a bequest? I mean, is there an endowment for the museum, or is it funded by the Smithsonian and the U.S. government support? How does the funding? I mean, how many visitors do you have in a year to these collections? Just curious.
Well, yes, Freer left an endowment originally in his last will. That endowment came in the form of stock options, actually, which is interesting, and it served us quite well. I mean, the museum relies on that endowment still, not just for new purchases, but also for its operations. And but in terms of growing the collections for purchases, there are a number of ways to do so. One is, through the endowments that we have, or through, targeted purchases by some of our benefactors, or, through gifts, of course, which is always wonderful. So there are a number of ways to do that. And visitor numbers, and I don't have any very recent figures in mind, because it probably would be zero at this time. But for Hokusai, I know, because of course, selfishly I follow that, because it's the exhibition that I worked on with the team. That had about 100,000 people in its first few months, which is a substantial number, and particularly. Because we are not a gigantic museum, right? I mean, as you mentioned, the space is contemplative, and you can spend an entire day, but you can also spend just an hour or less in the space, right? But I encourage everybody to stay as much as you can, and come if you're able to travel again.
So, do you have any idea when you might be opening again, or is that all just, wait till we have a vaccine?
Yeah, that is an answer that is really above my own pay grade. And what I do know is that the Freer and Sackler, as part of the Smithsonian, works with the Smithsonian's under the Smithsonian's reopening schedule. So in other words, I am not at this time privy to a specific date, but I'm hoping. What I can do is having my fingers crossed, and I hope for some time later this fall, maybe.
Are all the Smithsonian museums are now closed? The entire.
Yes, all museums are closed except for the zoo and the a branch of the National Air and Space Museum that is called the Adva Center out in Dulles Airport, where you can look at planes and rockets and various other interesting things.
Plenty of room for social distancing out there, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. So before we wind this up, I'd like to ask you to say something about the other collections. I noticed, again, I want to encourage everybody to go to the National Museum of Asian Art and look at not just what is available at the Freer and the Sackler, but also generally in the other collections. But can you say something about what those other collections are and which arts they are? I noticed there's even some music and such.
Well, so the collections basically range into every area that is considered Asia in the broadest sense. And for us, Asia starts, in Cairo and moves its way eastward, basically, because Freer in his travels also spent significant amount of time in the Near East and in Egypt, and collected some extraordinary works there as well. A very, very early Bible manuscript, for example. And so the collections are substantial it's an easy and almost a boastful answer, but they are substantial in every area, really, in the Near East, ancient Near East as well, in modern and contemporary art, and that's certainly a growing area for sure. And Chinese art is a very important pillar also of Freer's traditional collecting. And then Southeast Asia is a growing area that the museum expanded into more recently, and is hoping to build that area as well. And then South Asia, we have a substantial collection of
Is the Chinese painting collection, and was that collected by Freer as well?
Yes, many of those were. I mean, he was interested in China to a large degree, and on his, although in his first trips to Asia, he mainly spent time in Japan, out of East Asia as a whole. But in 1911, he actually only stopped over in Japan briefly and then went to China and spent a significant amount of time there, traveling throughout along the Silk Road as well. So he brought together quite a number of extraordinary works, but the collections grow. So the Chinese painting collection has, in the 90s, added a significant group of paintings by Bada Shanren, the famous Ming Dynasty exile. And so the collections are constantly evolving, really. And there is no part of the collection in the Freer Gallery of Art and also in the Sackler that is frozen in time, except for the American collection, which we are not allowed by way of Freer's will to add anything on to.
Okay.
He wanted that to be complete.
And you want to say anything about that collection?
You're asking me to speak about areas that I would embarrass myself to make any try to make any informed statements, so I'd rather not.
But
we do
my understanding is you have the Peacock Room, which is a centerpiece of the museum itself. It's really quite an extraordinary Whistler creation, right? Right.
I mean, that was conceived as the dining room for a British collector in the United Kingdom by the name of Leyland, and who was, the story goes as such that Whistler just had its way with the room while he was away, and he was just dumbstruck to find it look anything like he had wanted. And wasn't too pleased with the result, but Freer appreciated its importance and its aesthetic and brought it over to Detroit, and eventually upon Freer's death, it made its way to the Freer and is now on permanent display. And just like the Peacock Room, Whistler is a key portion of the American collections. We have the biggest collection of his works. And then, a number of other American painters of that generation.
Yeah. So you can see an Asian and American fusion in that room, I would say. It's really quite an extraordinary room. I think we're at time now, so I'm going to wind up by thanking Frank Feltens for today's presentation about the Japan collection at the Freer. I don't know if nobody I think has their mic on, so we can't give you a round of applause, but you can imagine a virtual round of applause. And thank you so much, and really appreciate it. I hope everybody, if you do get to Washington, please visit the Freer, and you know, drop Frank a note if you do get there. Thanks so much for joining today, and with that, we'll close now.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks again.
Have a good day.
Yeah. Have a good one. Take care.